driving late one evening on a back road when his car broke down. No cell signal, no houses nearby, just darkness and silence. He sat there for a while, frustrated and worried, thinking that he was completely alone. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Another driver pulled over, got out, and said, "Looks like you could use some help." Together they got the car running again. And later the man said, "The hardest part wasn't the broken car. It was those few minutes when I thought I was stranded and all alone." And isn't that often the deeper struggle in life? Not simply the burden that we carry, but the fear that we carry it alone. And that brings us right into today's gospel. The story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus began in disappointment. The two disciples were walking away from Jerusalem, and that matters, because Jerusalem was the city of promise, the place where they believed that God's plan would unfold and everything would finally make sense. But now they are leaving. Why? Because hope, as they understood it, has collapsed. They say to Jesus, though they do not recognize him, "We were hoping." My brothers and sisters, those may be some of the saddest words in the gospel. We were hoping. We were hoping for healing, for peace, for God to act in the way that we expected. Now, many of us here today know something of that experience, because disappointment, difficult as it is, can be part of the journey of discipleship. Sometimes faith includes confusion. Sometimes the road includes questions. And sometimes we walk with burdens that we fully don't understand. And that is where this gospel becomes so powerful. Because while these disciples think that they are walking away from the story, Christ is already walking with them. They just don't recognize him. And isn't that often true in our own lives? There are moments when God feels absent, and yet later we realize that he was closer than we knew. He was with us in grief, in uncertainty, in unanswered questions. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus does something remarkable. He does not immediately reveal himself. He walks with them, he listens, he lets them speak their disappointment, and then he begins to interpret the scriptures, showing them how even the suffering and death of the Messiah fit into God's plan. In other words, he helps them to see what looked like defeat was actually victory. That what looked like an ending was actually the beginning. And that matters. Because one of the greatest temptations in spiritual life is to assume that when we do not understand what God is doing, he must not be doing anything. But the resurrection tells us otherwise. God is often working most deeply when we understand him least. In the first reading, St. Peter proclaims exactly this. Jesus was crucified, yes, but not defeated. Peter says God raised him up, freeing him from death. Death did not have the final word. And Peter proclaims this boldly because the resurrection changes everything. If Christ is risen, suffering can be redeemed. If Christ is risen, sin does not have the final word. If Christ is risen, even death has been conquered. That is why the second reading speaks of us being ransomed by the precious blood of Christ. Our hope is not built on wishful thinking. It is built on the living Christ. But notice something else in the Emmaus story. The disciples recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread. That, my brothers and sisters, is the Mass. We do not simply remember Emmaus. In every Mass, we enter into its pattern again. Christ speaks to us in the Scriptures, and he is recognized in the breaking of the bread. And in this Mass, that same risen Lord is about to meet us again. That same Christ who walked with them walks with us, opens our eyes, and turns our hearts back to him. Because notice what happens at the end of the gospel. The disciples who were walking away from Jerusalem now turn around and rush back to Jerusalem. Everything changes. Why? Because an encounter with the risen Christ always changes direction. It turns despair into hope, confusion into clarity, and retreat into mission. And maybe this is where this gospel speaks most personally to each of us today. Some part of our hearts may be drifting from trust, from hope, even from prayer. Then hear this. Christ is already walking with you, even if you do not yet recognize him. And maybe today he is doing for you what he did for those disciples, opening the scriptures, warming the heart, and preparing you to recognize him again. Remember what they said afterwards. Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way? That is one of the signs of Christ's presence, a heart awakened by truth. So today, maybe the question is not simply, where is God? Maybe the deeper question is, where has Christ been walking beside me, and I have not yet recognized him? And maybe we return to the man at the beginning of this homily. He thought the hardest part was the broken down car, but it wasn't. The hardest part was believing that he was alone. And maybe, my friends, that is true for us as well. Sometimes the deepest burden is not the suffering itself, but the fear that we are carrying it by ourselves. But the road to Emmaus tells us otherwise. Christ walks with his people. Christ walks beside us, even in confusion, disappointment, and the moments that we fail to recognize him. And often, like those disciples, like that stranded driver, we only realize later that we were never alone to begin with. My brothers and sisters, the road to Emmaus is not just their story, it is our story. We walk, we struggle, we question, and Christ comes to meet us. In word and sacrament, he opens our eyes. And when he does, we begin to see that we were never alone.